They told the photographer to crop me out of the family photo. That's how I found out I was just a shadow. The invitation came on a Wednesday, halfway through reheated soup and silence. I opened the envelope slowly, like it might bite. Inside, a flat, impersonal card, thick paper, gold letters, expensive, cold. You are cordially invited to the company's 25th anniversary celebration. No, dear Dad. No, we'd love for you to join us. Not even a scribble in the corner. Just a sterile phrase at the bottom. It would be nice to see you there. Nice. Not important. Not necessary. Just nice. I placed it on the table and stared at it. The way you stare at a gravestone. The longer I looked, the more it felt like a formality, like I was being included because it would have looked bad not to. I could already imagine the conversations. Well, we did invite him. Yes, of course he was on the list. A checkbox, a technicality. My hands didn't shake, but my heart, it folded a little more inward. You see, I wasn't just some distant uncle or forgotten family friend. I was the one who built their first office with my own hands. I laid the tiles, wired the sockets, installed the first lock on the front door. When they couldn't afford an architect, I sketched plans on napkins. When the bank laughed at their loan request, I co-signed. I took a second mortgage on my house, the same house they now call old and falling apart. And now, I was furniture they didn't know where to put. I sat on the edge of the bed that night, holding the invitation like a wound. My wife would have known what to say. She always did. But she'd been gone 4 years now, and the silence in the house had gotten used to itself. Still, I whispered aloud, to no one. Should I even go? No answer came. Just the ticking of the clock, the same clock that used to hang in our kitchen before my son said, "We're going for a more modern look," and packed it away. But deep down, I knew I would go. Not because they wanted me there, but because I had promised myself, long ago, to never let pride make me small. My presence wasn't for them. It was for the part of me that still stood tall, even in the shadow they tried to put me in. I pulled my good shirt from the back of the closet, still wrapped in dry cleaner's plastic from my grandson's christening. He's 12 now, doesn't talk to me much. Said I smell like wood and old books. I suppose that's fair. I still keep sawdust in my coat pockets. I polished my shoes with an old rag and spit. Caught the 6:40 bus from the corner, same one I used to take to the factory in the 80s. I looked around at the passengers, young, glowing, busy on their phones. None of them looked up. It's funny how a man can build bridges and still go unseen. When I got to the venue, a giant glass-walled place they probably paid too much for, the valet asked me if I was with deliveries. I said no. He shrugged, pointed toward the side entrance. I went in the front door anyway. Inside, everything gleamed. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, music that sounded expensive and meant nothing. I paused at the entrance. I wasn't on the welcome list. No handshake, no smile. No one said, "Glad you made it." I stood there for 5 full minutes, coat in hand, until a girl with a headset rushed past and asked, "Are you one of the tech crew?" I shook my head. "Oh, sorry, you looked—" Never mind. She vanished into the crowd, and I felt it again, that old familiar ache of being misrecognized, or worse, unnoticed. Then I saw him, my son, laughing with 2 men in suits, a glass of something golden in his hand, one arm around his wife's waist, the other gesturing wide as he told a story. The crowd around him laughed, that performative kind of laughter people give to powerful men. For a moment I thought he saw me. His eyes met mine, froze, and then slid right past me. Just like that, I disappeared again. But I didn't turn around. I didn't walk out. I simply exhaled, found a chair in the corner, and sat. My place in the room wasn't given, but I claimed it anyway, because I knew what they didn't. You can erase someone from the guest list. You can even crop them out of the photo. But you can't delete the foundation beneath your feet. And I was still that foundation, quiet, cracked, maybe, but unshaken. Not yet. You can erase someone from the guest list. You can even crop them out of the photo. But you can't delete the foundation beneath your feet. And I was still that foundation, quiet, cracked, maybe, but unshaken. Not yet. Friends, Let me pause for just a moment. Would you share in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this? Being forgotten, overlooked by your own family? If this story speaks to you, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow and keep telling these stories that matter. And now, let's continue. The room pulsed with celebration. Laughter rang out like polished brass, high and bright. Glasses clinked in perfect rhythm, the kind of sound that only exists in carefully curated happiness. Music swirled through the air, elegant and expensive, a string quartet playing something no one was really listening to. People hugged with one arm while holding wine in the other, smiles too wide, eyes always scanning for someone more important to greet. And I stood there, still by the entrance, watching them pass by like I was a coat rack they didn't quite know where to put. Eventually, someone noticed me, a young man in a tight vest, a clipboard under his arm. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're Mr. Brooks, right?" he asked, already turning his head away. I nodded. He pointed quickly across the hall. "We've got you seated near the back, right over there, sir." Then he was gone. I followed the direction he gave, past golden centerpieces and rows of white linen tables, each one glimmering under the chandeliers, rows of chairs marked with elegant place cards. Laughter grew louder as I passed, the kind that turns private jokes into performances, the kind that never quite reaches the lonely corners of a room. And then I saw it, my seat. Not a chair, really, not like the others. It was old, wooden, slightly warped, one leg shorter than the rest. No name card, no setting, no space cleared for me at a table. It sat awkwardly against the wall beside the broom closet, next to a service door that swung open every few minutes with the sound of clanging trays and distant kitchen shouting, and behind me, the bathroom sign flickering, its light broken. I stared at the chair for a while, just stood there. No one noticed. They walked past me, laughing, hugging, sipping champagne, some brushing my shoulder as they passed like I was part of the furniture. Some glanced my way with the confusion people give to janitors at black tie events. "Are you supposed to be here?" I sat down slowly. The chair creaked under my weight. My knees ached. They always do in the cold. And this corner had none of the warmth that filled the rest of the room. I folded my hands in my lap, tried not to mind the draft that came every time the service door opened, tried not to mind the stares that didn't land, or the laughter that didn't include me, tried not to mind the way my own son's voice boomed from the stage, calling out names, thanking colleagues, mentors, partners. My name was not one of them. I watched him raise a glass, his eyes shining under the lights. I remember those eyes when they were young, when they lit up just from me walking through the door. Now they looked right through me, as if the years I gave, the sleep I lost, the hours I bled into his future, had been quietly swept away, like dust in a corner. A waiter passed and offered sparkling wine to the row beside me. He didn't offer me a glass, just kept moving. A child walked by, maybe 7 or 8, her silver shoes tapping across the marble, and looked at me curiously. She paused, stared. Then her mother called her away, whispering, "Don't bother him." Bother, that's what I was now. Not a guest, not family, just something in the way. It's strange how silence feels louder in a room full of people. How you can sit among hundreds and feel like you've disappeared entirely. How your name can vanish, not in one moment, but in thousands of quiet choices. The missing photo, the chair with no number, the corner no one wants to look at. And still I stayed. Not because I didn't feel the humiliation, but because I needed to know how far they'd let it go. How invisible a man had to become before someone asked, "Where is he?" No one asked. Not yet. He walked right past me. My son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through thunderstorms, the boy I taught how to tie a tie, how to drive, how to keep his word, walked by me like I wasn't even there. He held a glass of champagne, golden and glinting, his other hand resting on the back of someone else's chair. Laughter bloomed around him like perfume, rich, practiced, rehearsed. He leaned in close to old colleagues, slapped the backs of investors, kissed the cheeks of people who hadn't known him when he was still afraid of the dark. But me? He passed within inches of me, within breathing distance, and didn't so much as flinch. No nod, no pause, not even a flicker of recognition. Just absence. A stranger would have looked, out of courtesy, out of instinct, but not him. And somehow that hurt more than any insult ever could. It wasn't that he forgot me. Forgetting requires effort. No, he unlearned me. Like I was something he had scrubbed clean from his story. I sat still in my crooked chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor like I was afraid they might betray the tears I'd buried. I'd been preparing for this moment for years in some way. The slow fade out, the way children, once grown, begin to edit their memories. I knew he'd changed, but I didn't think he'd erase me. I remembered a winter night, long ago, when the pipes in his apartment burst. He was 23, called me in panic. I got there within the hour, toolbox in one hand, thermos of soup in the other. I worked until 3 in the morning, hands frozen stiff, just to stop the flooding. He fell asleep on the couch while I was still crouched under the sink, never even said good night. I remembered when he dropped out of college for a year, said he needed time. Everyone else judged him, but not me. I stood between him and their accusations, told them he'd figure it out. He did. Eventually, and when he graduated, he never thanked me. He thanked the journey. I remembered the night his daughter was born. I was the one who drove his wife to the hospital. I was the one who sat with her during those contractions while he was stuck in traffic. And when the baby came, I stood by the door, waiting, heart pounding. He called his friends, his in-laws. He didn't call me in. These memories, they piled in my chest like bricks, each one heavier than the last, and yet I carried them all the same. Because that's what fathers do. We carry without being asked. We give without counting. But now, here he was, at the peak of his success, in a room he built atop the scaffolding of all I gave, and I had become a ghost in his eyes. He raised his glass for another toast, called out someone's name, a mentor, a teacher, a friend. People cheered, laughed, applauded. And me? I clapped too, quietly, out of habit, out of love that refused to vanish just because I had. No one noticed. A man near me asked, "Hey, could you scoot over a bit? I want to lean here." I moved, gave him space, became smaller. That's what happens, isn't it? We start out as giants in their world, towering protectors, infinite sources of comfort, and somewhere along the way, we shrink. Not from age, but from neglect, from being overlooked, from not being named. I looked at my son again. His smile was wide, perfect for the camera. His suit tailored, his posture straight. He looked like a man who had it all, and maybe he did, except for the one thing that still sat in the corner, waiting to be acknowledged. Me. And yet despite everything, despite the ache, the insult, the quiet shame, I still hoped that maybe, even just for a second, he would turn, not to perform, not to impress, but to truly see me. That moment didn't come, but I stayed, because I had built this, not just the company or the house or the road he walked, but him. And even if he couldn't see me anymore, I still remembered who I was. The laughter reached a pitch I hadn't heard in years, sharp, celebratory, gilded with just the right amount of pride. They toasted to milestones, to mergers, to awards and expansions. A man at the head table raised his glass so high it nearly tipped, and the whole room followed like it was instinct. Like this ritual of clinking glass and shouting names was sacred. Names flew through the air like confetti. Jake, the marketing guy who brought in the youth. Mara, the intern turned executive. Even Mr. Collins, the neighbor who used to mow their lawn and later planted flowers outside the office building, was given a long, warm thank you. People clapped like he'd cured something. I didn't clap, not because I wasn't happy for him, but because my hands had gone still. Not out of bitterness, just out of hollowness. No one said my name, not once, even as they traced the history of the company, from the dusty backroom beginnings to this polished hall of success. They skipped the part where I sat at the kitchen table, night after night, drafting their first blueprints with a pencil so worn it left grooves in my fingers. Skip the part where I pitched their idea to old friends who trusted me, not a spreadsheet. Skip the night I stayed up wiring the first server cabinet while my back screamed and my wife begged me to rest. I wasn't just part of the foundation, I was the foundation. But somehow the story had rewritten itself, replacing fathers with advisors, replacing sacrifice with slogans. One man leaned toward another at a nearby table and whispered, not even trying to be discreet, "Who's that guy in the back?" "Dunno," the other replied, chuckling. "He's probably just some retired accountant or something. Just, that word again, the knife that dulls and still cuts. Not the man who signed the second mortgage to fund their dream. Not the one who hand-built their first office desk when they couldn't afford furniture. Not the one who held the line when the numbers didn't add up, when the investors backed away, when their own resolve cracked. Just a number man. I felt heat rise in my chest, but it wasn't anger. It was grief. Grief for a presence that had become a rumor in a room I helped build. Grief for being edited out so casually, and not by enemies or strangers, but by my own blood, my own son. He stood again, smiling for photos, posing with executives, holding his wife's hand like a trophy. And I watched him speak with pride about vision and hard work, and those who believed in him. The words echoed like gospel in the hall. And still he didn't look toward the back. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he thought if he met my eyes, it would remind him of things he buried, of debts unpaid, of loyalty unreturned. Maybe it would shake the myth he'd built of pulling himself up by his own brilliance. Because in that myth, I didn't fit. I took a sip of lukewarm water someone had left behind. It tasted flat, like silence. And in that silence, I remembered the night he told me, "Dad, I want to start something big, but I don't know if I have what it takes." I didn't hesitate. I said, "Then I'll lend you what you need until you believe you have it." That was years ago. Now he had everything he ever wanted. The building, the partners, the praise. And I sat near the broom closet, forgotten like a borrowed tool that had done its job and was no longer needed. But I stayed, not because I enjoyed the pain, not because I thought it would change, but because someone had to witness this truth. Quietly, steadily, without needing applause or microphones. Because legacy is not measured in who gets mentioned. It's measured in what still stands after the names fade. I heard it before I saw them. Two voices, young, sharp, and careless. The kind of voices that never had to earn respect, only inherit it. They stood a few feet behind me, near the floral display that spilled like a waterfall of wealth across the banquet wall. One of them, a young woman in a silver dress, tilted her head in my direction and whispered, just loud enough, "Who's that man over there? Sitting alone?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just curious, like she was pointing out a misplaced vase, a question tossed into the air without weight. The boy beside her, my grandson, laughed. He didn't even glance back. "Oh, him?" he said with a grin. "No one, just some family friend. He used to help with paperwork or something. I think he's retired now." He chuckled again and took a sip from his glass. The girl giggled, leaning closer. I didn't turn, not because I wasn't listening, but because I was trying to keep something from shattering inside me. I knew the sound of my grandson's laughter. I used to live for it. I remember the way he used to run into my arms when he was small, the way his whole face lit up when I pulled a coin from behind his ear or let him hammer a nail into my workshop bench. I remembered the night he cried after a nightmare and wouldn't sleep unless I lay beside him, my hand over his heart. And now I was someone who helped with paperwork. I didn't expect fame. I didn't want a stage. But I had dared to believe that blood meant something, that love left footprints deep enough not to be erased by suits and status. I felt something close in my chest. Not anger, not pride, something more final, something like the quiet extinguishing of a flame that had burned too long, too alone. People talk about heartbreak like it's a loud thing, yelling, weeping, collapsing to your knees. But real heartbreak is a whisper, a name not said, a chair placed by the broom closet, a grandson's laugh, forgetting who used to carry him through the rain. I sat still, my hands trembling just slightly. I ran my thumb over the edge of the napkin on my lap, a gesture to ground myself, to keep the grief from showing on my face. No one noticed. They didn't see the way I had just died a little. Right there, in that rented hall, surrounded by people who smiled without memory. Later, another waiter passed with a tray of desserts. Small tarts, carefully arranged. He offered one to the table nearby. Skipped me. I didn't call him back. What would I say? That I'm family? That I helped build all this? That once I was the man they looked up to? Number that time had passed. I understood now. I had not been forgotten. I had been replaced by their own stories, their retellings, their version of events that didn't include the man who tightened the bolts when their dreams were still wobbly and young, the man who sacrificed birthdays, vacations, and comfort so they could have moments like this. And now, I was a footnote they couldn't quite remember how to pronounce. Still I stayed, because walking out would feel like agreeing with them, like confirming that I was as small as they now believed. And I wasn't. I had built too much, loved too deeply, stayed too long to vanish quietly. Even if they called me no one, I knew who I was. And someday, maybe not tonight, maybe not even this year, the truth would press through the cracks in their perfect stories. And when it did, they'd remember the man in the corner, the one they whispered about, the one who never stopped showing up, even when they stopped seeing him. The wall caught my eye when I stood to stretch my legs. A slow, quiet movement, just to shake the cold out of my knees. It was near the center of the room, glowing beneath warm light, adorned with golden frames and elegant captions. People gathered around it, pointing, laughing, posing for new photos beside the old ones. The Legacy Wall, someone called it, a tribute to the company's journey, its faces, its foundations. I approached slowly. Part of me already knew what I'd find. But hope is a stubborn thing. It lingers, even when reason tells it to leave. The first frame showed a grainy photo of a garage, their first office before anything existed. My son stood beside a cardboard sign with the company name written in shaky marker. I was the one who took that photo. He hadn't wanted to smile that day, said it all felt too small. I made a joke. He smiled, and I captured the moment. I wasn't in the picture. But that was fine. I was the one behind the lens. The next frame showed the ribbon cutting at the first real office. I remembered that day vividly. I had stayed up all night sanding the entrance doors, making sure the hinges didn't squeak, repainting the parking signs by hand. My palms were still raw when I arrived. My suit didn't fit quite right. But I stood beside him, my hand on his back as the scissors snapped through the ribbon. That photo didn't show me. They had cropped it. Just my son's proud smile and the mayor beside him holding the scissors. Photo after photo, memory after memory. I scanned them all. The construction site I helped design. The day the first shipment arrived and I unloaded boxes with a slip disc. The first expo when I fixed the display table with duct tape minutes before the crowd arrived. I searched for myself like a man digging through ashes, hoping to find something unburned. But I wasn't there, not once. Not even in the corners, not blurred in the background, not in reflection. I had been erased, not forgotten. No, forgetting is passive. This was intentional, deliberate, clean. Like they had drawn a red line through my name and photoshopped history to look prettier without me. A woman beside me whispered to her husband, "It's amazing how far they've come." He nodded, awed. All on their own, from nothing. I turned away. From nothing. I suppose the years I spent bending over blueprints at the kitchen table were nothing. The nights I walked their crying baby in circles so they could sleep. Nothing. The loans I signed, the tools I gave, the roof I lost. Nothing. Legacy. That word hung heavy in the air, spelled in gold above the photos. And yet it mocked me. Because a true legacy is not what the world sees. It's what remains when the applause fades. But in this room, in these frames, I had no name. No proof, no past. I stood quietly in front of the wall, my reflection staring back at me from the glass. I looked older there, smaller, but I held that gaze, because while they could crop me out of their pictures, they couldn't rewrite what my hands had built. I was there. I remembered the sweat, the noise, the fatigue, the pride. I remembered the way my son's voice shook when he gave his first speech, and how I squeezed his shoulder from behind the curtain. I remembered the way he hugged me after the deal closed, whispering, "We did it, Dad." And now, we had become he. And I had become inconvenient, a cracked frame they chose not to hang. Still, I didn't break. I straightened my back, took one last look at the curated version of truth they had chosen, then stepped away, slowly, carefully, like walking out of a room that no longer remembered you ever lived there. Because some stories are not told in pictures, they're told in quiet sacrifices, in calloused hands, in memories no camera ever caught, but which built everything worth capturing. The din of celebration felt distant, as if filtered through a wall. My throat was dry, but none of the waiters had offered me water. The glasses on the tables around me gleamed with condensation, as if mocking my parched lips and empty glass. I shifted in my creaky chair, the wood biting into my spine, and tried to ignore the ache in my chest that was far deeper than thirst. Then he appeared, a young waiter carrying a silver tray. His crisp white shirt and black bow tie looked sharp, but his eyes held something softer, more human. He paused beside me, leaned in just slightly, and quietly said, "Sir, may I bring you something special?" No script, no rehearsed smile, just genuine concern. He must have noticed the dust collecting on my untouched wine glass, or sensed the tension in my shoulders as I folded and unfolded my napkin for the 100th time. He held his tray like a lifeline, offering more than food, offering acknowledgement. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that I didn't need special treatment. But my tongue felt thick, so I simply nodded, and he placed a glass of ice water before me. Its coolness gave me strength I hadn't realized I needed. Then he turned and moved on, vanishing back into the flow of ceremony. In that moment, I realized a stranger had shown me more courtesy than my own family. A boy I'd never met had treated me with respect, drawn not from obligation, but from empathy. It was a sting, a reminder that blood ties can grow brittle when gratitude and memory slip away. I lifted the glass to my lips and drank deep, letting the cold water chase away the haze of humiliation. Each swallow felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered earlier years how my daughter once handed me a glass of lemonade after I finished repairing her bicycle. How my son used to fetch me tea when I worked late on his science project. Those simple acts of care that felt routine then, but now, in their absence, felt like treasures lost. Opening my eyes, I watched the young waiter guide another guest to a table. His shoulders relaxed, his steps light. No one rushed him. No one brushed past him as if he were scenery. I imagined telling that boy, "Thank you." But the moment passed, and he was gone before I could find my voice. Still, his gesture echoed in my mind, louder than the toasts and laughter, louder than the polished speeches on stage. It reminded me that kindness can slip through the cracks where obligation fails. That even when your own blood forgets who you are, a stranger's compassion can mend a part of what was broken. I sat back and let the music swell around me. For the first time that night, I felt my spine straighten, not because I expected to be honored, but because I remembered what it meant to be treated like a person, not a footnote. And in that remembrance, I found a quiet strength to keep my place in this room, no longer merely enduring, but determined to bear witness. The double doors burst open with practiced drama, and the room erupted into applause. Forks paused midair, conversations dropped like pebbles into silence. All eyes turned toward the entrance. The mayor had arrived. He stood tall beneath the archway, wrapped in a tailored navy suit and importance. Cameras flashed. Someone began clapping faster, louder, and the crowd followed like a wave. He smiled. That smile politicians wear, the one that knows how to be everywhere at once. He moved forward with ease, shaking hands, clapping backs, greeting people like he'd known them all his life. But I had known him longer, before the speeches, before the power, before the cameras. I had known him when he and my son were just two uncertain young men, building ideas on pizza boxes in my garage. I had fed them, encouraged them, corrected them, carried them more than once when they doubted themselves. I even drove the mayor, then just Eli, to his first interview. He had spilled coffee on his tie. I gave him mine. Now he moved through the crowd like royalty, and beside him, my son, glowing. Not as a boy anymore, but as a man who had traded in his story for a sharper one where men like me were edited out. Still, when the mayor entered, I stood. It was habit, not duty. Something in me still believed in dignity, in rising for another person, even when the world shrinks you. I rose slowly, my knees protesting, my hand brushing the side of the table for balance. I stood not to impress, I knew I wouldn't, but out of something I couldn't kill inside myself. Respect. It cost nothing. It had cost me everything. And he didn't see me. Not at first. He walked by, surrounded by people with perfect teeth and empty hands. They parted for him like water around a stone. He clutched my son's shoulder as he laughed, praising the visionary who had made all this possible. My son leaned in, whispered something. They both laughed again. I stayed standing, watching, waiting, part of me hoping he might turn, that he might remember. Then, just for a second, his eyes drifted beyond the spotlight, past the suits, past the stage, and he saw me. His smile paused, his gaze caught on mine, and in that moment, something flickered across his face, something soft, familiar, a memory maybe, a name returning. He gave a small nod, just that. No words, no grand gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement, barely visible beneath the weight of ceremony. But for a man like me, buried in shadows all night, it was enough to light a spark. I sat down again, slower this time. The applause was still going. The room hadn't noticed, but I had. He saw me. He remembered. For the first time that night, someone did. I didn't know what that nod would mean, whether it was just habit or guilt or genuine recognition, but in a hall full of forgetfulness, it felt like a whisper breaking through noise, a name spoken silently. And though I doubted my son saw that exchange, I began to wonder if it had planted something that might grow, or return. The mayor's voice carried with a kind of stillness that overpowered even silence. Everyone had expected something polished, a few lines about innovation, prosperity, partnership, the usual things officials say when cameras are pointed and glasses are full. But the weight of his pause told the room this would not be that kind of speech. The room leaned in, breathless, uncertain, unprepared. I know I was expected to speak about progress, he began, his voice calm but heavy, about vision and growth, and I will, eventually. A few nervous chuckles rippled, unsure if laughter was appropriate. But he didn't smile. He turned slowly, his eyes searching until they found mine again. But before I do, he said, I want to acknowledge someone who hasn't been acknowledged at all tonight. My body tensed. I didn't know whether to brace or breathe. There was a sound somewhere in the crowd, a glass being set down a little too hard. A whispered, "Wait, who?" from one of the younger guests. My grandson, perhaps. The mayor kept speaking. There's a man here tonight who did not take the stage, who didn't ask for credit, who didn't receive a single mention in the slideshow of legacy. People were turning now, slowly, the illusion of control unraveling. A few heads turned toward the stage, confused. A few began scanning the room, trying to catch on. This man didn't just believe in this company before anyone else. He built it. Not with investments, not with applause, but with his hands. With hours no one logged. With sacrifices no one filmed. I felt the shift, that electric current of collective realization when people begin to understand they've overlooked something, someone, essential. The room didn't feel proud anymore. It felt exposed. He turned fully toward me now. There was no ambiguity. His hand didn't point, but his eyes did. And I knew the entire room was looking at me. He's seated in the back, the mayor said softly, not out of humility, but because no one made space for him. It was unbearable and beautiful at the same time. My throat closed, my pulse thudded in my ears. My chair creaked slightly beneath me as I shifted, still frozen. The air around me was thick with something more powerful than sound. Recognition and shame, because they knew. They all knew now. He is the reason your CEO didn't quit when the money ran out. The reason the first building didn't collapse. The reason there was ever a second chance. And tonight, in a room full of history, he was nearly written out of it. No one whispered now. No one sipped. Even the servers paused mid-step, as if caught in the gravity of truth. The mayor lifted his glass, not high and triumphant, but slow and steady, like a man carrying something sacred. To Mr. Raymond Brooks, the man in the corner, whose shadow held all of this upright. There it was, my name. The name no one had said in hours, the name that wasn't in the program, or on a chair, or in a single line of credit. But now it echoed across crystal and marble and velvet suits. It didn't echo because of the sound, but because of the silence that followed it. And then the clapping started. Awkward, scattered. The kind of applause people give when their hands don't know whether they're applauding a man or apologizing to him. One table, then two. A few guests stood. I watched my son, still near the stage, frozen, his eyes fixed on mine, his mouth slightly open as if to speak, but he said nothing. Not yet. I stood slowly, the same legs that had been dismissed, that had stood behind scaffolding for hours, carrying wood and steel and dreams, the same spine that had bent to pick up the slack when no one else could. I stood, not because they clapped, but because I had always stood, whether they saw me or not. The room blurred slightly through the moisture in my eyes, but I did not cry. The moment was too full for tears. It was a return, a resurrection, and I wanted to feel every second of it. The mayor nodded once, not smiling, just seeing, and I nodded back. Two old men who knew the cost of building something that lasts. A young man near the front, one of the newer team members, maybe no older than 20, whispered something to his girlfriend. She looked at me with wide eyes, awe, and something like respect. He had just learned my name, but in that moment, he remembered it. I looked back toward my son. He hadn't clapped yet. His hands were still at his sides, heavy with something even applause couldn't lift. But his eyes were different, no longer full of certainty, no longer the polished man in the spotlight. They were the eyes of a boy again, a boy who had once been proud to call me Dad. And just for a second, I saw the weight of memory return to him, not regret, not yet, but the beginning of it. At first they turned as if compelled by some unseen current. Slow, unsure, like people waking up from a dream they thought was real. One by one, heads twisted over shoulders. A room once brimming with noise now moved with quiet discomfort. The clinking of forks against plates stopped completely. A few napkins dropped into laps. Laughter froze mid-breath and hung there, embarrassed, hollow. Their eyes searched for me, the man who had always been in the background, but had somehow become the center of the room without taking a single step. I felt it like a wave rolling across the hall, the shift from neglect to attention. But this wasn't admiration, not yet. It was realization, the kind that stings, the kind that strips off the polite smile and forces people to see what they chose not to. They had laughed without me, toasted without me, spoken of history without ever naming the hands that wrote it. But now the story had been corrected, and they didn't know where to look. Some faces held confusion, others shame. A few, the younger ones, held no recognition at all. To them I was just an old man standing by the bathroom, a mystery that had cracked open mid-banquet. But to those who should have known, my son's business partners, old friends of the family, the neighbor who borrowed my ladder and never gave it back, I was not a stranger. I was a secret they had quietly agreed to ignore. The mayor stood silent beside the stage, glass still raised. The weight of his words still hung in the air like fog refusing to lift. And then, with a quiet voice and a gravity that carried more than a command, he said, "Mr. Brooks, Would you please stand again? Let us at least try to begin an apology. It wasn't a request. It was a reckoning. I was already standing, but I felt something in me rise even taller. Not my posture, not my pride. Something older, truer, a dignity that hadn't died. It had only been silenced, buried beneath years of dismissal and silence. The spotlight finally turned, hesitating for a second before resting on me. I didn't blink, I didn't smile. I simply stood there, shoulders square, eyes steady, as the light found its rightful place. Gasps echoed. One woman covered her mouth. Another, perhaps a family friend, whispered, "Oh my God, he's here, all this time." Someone tried to clap again, hesitant, but the room didn't follow this time. This wasn't a moment for applause. It was too raw for that, too heavy. Applause would have felt like dressing a wound without cleaning it first. No, what followed was something deeper. A silence that said, we were wrong. My son had not moved. He stood by the mayor, hands limp, mouth half open, like a boy caught cheating in front of a teacher he once admired. The color had drained from his face. The armor of confidence, the posture he had worn all evening, cracked slightly. Our eyes met again. He didn't look away this time, and I could see it, the storm gathering behind his stare. Not defiance, not denial, but the slow dawning understanding of what he had done, not just tonight, but year after year. The calls he hadn't made, the chairs he hadn't offered, the stories he told where I was simply a friend, or worse, not mentioned at all. The slow erasure of a man who had been the scaffold behind every brick of his rise. The mayor lowered his glass now. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The silence did the talking. I remained still, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because I understood what this moment was. It wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was truth, finally cracking through the surface. I looked around at the faces. Some red with guilt, others pale with shock, some genuinely remorseful, others just embarrassed. A few guests shifted in their seats, clearly wanting to escape, to pretend it wasn't about them. But it was. It was about every hand that passed me without a shake, every eye that slid past mine, every voice that chose to speak only the version of history that sparkled. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't need their clapping. But I wanted them to feel it, to sit in the silence they had left me in, to taste the bitter truth they had served for years, cold, unacknowledged. In that moment, I wasn't a man forgotten. I was a man remembered, not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded anything, but because someone, finally, had spoken what no one else dared, and the room would never unhear it. I rose to my feet, not for them, but for myself, for every unspoken sacrifice that had been stacked behind my quiet back. My legs trembled at first, the weight of years bearing down, but I straightened slowly, deliberately, until I stood tall in the soft wash of chandelier light. At that moment, the room broke. A swell of applause rippled outward, hesitant at the start, as if guests were unsure what note to strike. Then, like an ocean reluctantly stirred by wind, the clapping grew louder. But it was not the triumphant roar reserved for heroes. It was a muted, apologetic sound, palms meeting leather and cloth, eyes downcast, heads bowed. They applauded not because they celebrated me, but because they mourned what they'd lost and finally recognized. Their hands struck one another in a rhythm of shame and grief, a benediction for the years they had spent erasing my presence. I felt each clap land on my soul like raindrops on stone, slow, insistent, shaping me. My son watched from the stage's edge, his face ashen. I could see the lines of regret tracing across his features, the silent question echoing in his gaze. How did we let this happen? But I did not look at him. I looked above the crowd at the vaulted ceiling where the light pooled like forgiveness. Time slowed. I heard the echo of every glass that hadn't been filled for me, the echo of every name they'd toasted without mine, the echo of every photo they'd cropped clean. That echo was loud here, under the roof I'd helped raise, and these claps were its answer. There were no tears, not yet. This was not catharsis, but reckoning. I let the sound wash over me, felt it lift a burden I hadn't realized I carried, an invisible shackle forged from neglect. With every respectful clap, I felt lighter. I felt seen. The applause lingered until it became uncomfortable, shifting from atonement back toward celebration. But I held still, letting the room find its balance again without me hastening its recovery. When the last hand stilled, I offered a small nod of acknowledgement. No words, no speech. I understood that in that moment, silence was more powerful than any oration, and so I stood there, center of a room that once blurred me into the background, until the applause had nothing more to offer. Then, with a gentle exhale, I returned to my seat, back straight, heart steadied. I was changed, and so was everyone else. They had given me what I never asked for, but perhaps always deserved: the simple act of truly seeing me. He came to me after the room had emptied, footsteps hesitant against the polished floor. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything unspoken between us. Years of silence, of empty chairs at dinners, of birthdays he spent with strangers. His face was raw, eyes rimmed with red that spoke of more than tonight's revelations. They spoke of a lifetime of regret, of love tangled with shame. He stood before me without ceremony. No flourish, no fanfare. Just the son I knew, smaller somehow, though his accomplishments had made him larger in the world. Now he looked fragile, vulnerable, a child again reaching for a hand he had once taken for granted. I watched him struggle for words, his lips quivering as he searched for the simplest of phrases, the one I had heard so often in my own youth. "I'm sorry." But the pride he carried like armor blocked it from his tongue. His chest heaved, shoulders rising and falling with unuttered confessions. He looked away, embarrassed by the tremor in his voice he couldn't quite harness. He traced invisible patterns on the table's edge, as if those faint grooves could guide him toward forgiveness. He wanted to close the gap between us, wanted to rebuild the bridge he had let crumble under the weight of success and busyness. But the distance felt insurmountable. I felt the years of sacrifice fold into that moment. Every cold morning I rose before dawn to draft plans. Every holiday I spent in silence while he chased his dreams. Every scar on my hands from tightening bolts he'd long since forgotten. I felt the echo of his childlike laughter when I'd carried him on my back through puddles, and the echo of his adult indifference now. I didn't speak. I simply raised my hand and offered a nod, gentle, affirming, full of the love I rarely voiced. My silence was a canvas upon which he could paint his apology. My nod was the permission he needed to release years of guilt in a single breath. He drew in a shuddering exhale, as if the act of acknowledging our shared past had unlocked something inside him. He closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing himself against the ache of memory, then slowly looked back at me, as if seeing me for the first time in decades. In that wordless exchange, everything shifted. The unspoken "I'm sorry" weighed heavy, yet unburdening. My nod said, "I hear you. I forgive you." It wrapped around him like a long-forgotten blanket, warm and familiar. He stayed there, uncertain what to do now that he'd found his voice. I patted the chair beside me, a silent invitation to sit. And when he did, the air between us softened, our shoulders brushing slightly, 2 generations meeting halfway in the hush after the storm. He didn't need to say more. The space between our breaths spoke volumes. Sometimes I thought words are overrated. When the heart speaks in silence, its voice is louder than any apology. And in that quiet communion, father and son, once estranged but reunited by truth, we found a language neither of us had dared to speak until now. They thought the night was over, plates cleared, lights dimmed, champagne thinning at the bottom of crystal glasses. People had begun to rise, to gather coats, to drift back into the lives where they were comfortable forgetting. But the mayor stepped forward again, as if something within him refused to let the silence settle, without finishing the truth he had begun earlier. He didn't go back to the podium. He didn't need a microphone. He simply turned to the crowd and raised his voice. Not loud, but steady, like someone placing a stone with purpose. "I need to say one more thing," he said, his eyes scanning the room with the clarity of a man who knew the weight of moments like this. "About Mr. Brooks." A few people stopped mid-conversation. A woman turned back, her clutch clutched tighter. My son sat beside me, still quiet, still trying to find what was left of himself inside this reckoning. I remained still, hands folded on my lap. "Most of you know me as your mayor," he continued, "but long before I ever stepped into politics, before the office, before the camera crews, before the suits, I was a kid with a folder of big ideas and no money. I wanted to change the world, but I didn't even have the means to apply for a grant." His voice wavered just slightly. "And Mr. Brooks, Raymond, didn't know me well. He didn't owe me anything, but he sat with me night after night, after his own long workdays, helping me revise that grant proposal. He didn't just fix my spelling. He helped me believe I had something worth saying." The room was completely still now, forks frozen midair. A few people leaned forward without realizing it. "And years later," he went on, "when this city's infrastructure nearly failed, when we were one faulty valve away from a disaster no one could afford, it was one of his designs that saved us. Not flashy, not celebrated. It wasn't in the papers, but it worked, quietly, perfectly, because he built it that way." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over me. The nights I spent revising those blueprints under a single flickering desk lamp, double-checking every line, not because anyone would ever see, but because I had to be sure, because someone's life might depend on a margin, on a calculation. "He is not just an engineer," the mayor said, his voice stronger now, conviction hardening in his chest. "He's a cornerstone, and the truth is, you've all been standing on his shoulders, every one of you." A murmur spread through the room, not disagreement, not even surprise, but the quiet realization of how deep their ignorance had run. Some of them had smiled at me earlier that night without knowing my name. Some had looked past me like I was decoration. Some had thought I was the janitor. Now they knew better, and knowing better has a weight. The mayor turned to me then. Our eyes met, and I saw no politics in him, no rehearsed expression, just a man who hadn't forgotten who held the ladder when he climbed. It's a strange thing to witness your own legacy not as a monument, but as a quiet awakening in the eyes of others. I didn't want applause. I didn't want another toast. I wanted this, that they see it wasn't luck or noise or charm that built their world. It was quiet endurance, care, precision, sacrifice that didn't come with spotlights. A young woman, maybe someone from marketing, lowered her gaze and whispered something to her neighbor. A man near the wall shook his head slowly, as if replaying moments he'd overlooked. My grandson, quiet for the first time that night, looked at me, really looked, and didn't turn away. And in that sea of shifting awareness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, that comes and goes, but weightlessness, like I had finally put down something I'd carried for too long. They had built their lives on stories of fame, but tonight they met the truth of legacy. And that truth didn't need a microphone. It only needed someone brave enough to say, we wouldn't be here if not for him. I didn't wait for dessert, not because I wasn't hungry or because I didn't like sweets. I had always had a quiet weakness for lemon tart. My wife used to make one that could silence an argument, but tonight, sweetness no longer mattered. Not the kind they served on plates. After the final toast and the hesitant applause, the music returned, quieter than before, as if aware of what had just happened. The guests began to stir again, voices low, laughter forced, clinking glasses a bit more measured. They shifted like people waking from a collective sleep, trying to remember where they were and what mattered. But I didn't stay. I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound of the legs scraping the floor seemed louder than the music. A few eyes followed me. I didn't meet them. I didn't need to. I had already been seen in the way that mattered most, not with admiration, but with understanding. My son rose slightly when I passed, almost as if to speak, to ask me to wait, to sit a while longer, maybe even to begin again. But the words caught in his throat. Too new, too raw. I gave him the same nod I'd given the mayor. Quiet. Enough. Then I turned away. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed door, no bitter words. Only the sound of my shoes against the marble floor, slow and steady. Behind me I could hear the whispers beginning, some soft, some sharp. Voices leaning close to ask, why didn't we know? And is that really his father? And the most fragile of all, what have we done? But I didn't turn around. I had no use for apologies shaped like discomfort. No need for hasty handshakes offered only because a man of power had reminded them who I was. I didn't crave their redemption. I had already found my own. The night air greeted me like an old friend, cool, clean, still. The world outside the grand hall felt different, softer, more honest. The stars didn't care who clapped or who forgot. They just shone, steady and quiet as they always had. I breathed them in like oxygen I'd been starved of. For the first time in years, I felt light, not because I had been honored, but because I had been unburdened. The weight of absence, of being unseen, of being needed only in silence. It was gone now. I had carried it too long, worn it like a second skin. But tonight, somewhere between the nod from an old friend and the broken silence of a crowded room, I had laid it down. I walked slowly down the stone path away from the hall, my back straight, my heart quiet. I didn't think about the missed invitations, the unreturned calls, the birthdays spent alone. Those belonged to the version of me they chose not to see. I was no longer asking to be included. I was no longer waiting to be remembered. I was simply walking forward. The city lights blinked in the distance, and somewhere a wind picked up, carrying with it the faint murmur of music and laughter, still trapped inside that glass box I'd left behind. It sounded smaller now, softer, like an echo already fading, and I smiled, not because I had won, but because I had let go. They would talk, they would whisper, they would wake in the night and wonder why they hadn't said more, hadn't done better. That was their journey now. Mine was to keep walking. And I did. Not bitter, not broken, but free. A week passed before they found it. It had slipped between the folds of the seat cushion, the same crooked chair they'd placed by the service doors, beside the flickering restroom sign and the scent of bleach. No one had thought to check it that night. It wasn't a place of honor, after all. It was just a forgotten seat for a man they nearly forgot. But when the staff cleaned up days later, when the tablecloths were folded and the wine glasses boxed, someone lifted the cushion and saw the edge of a white envelope. No name on the front, just a single word written in an old, familiar hand. For those who stayed behind. It made its way back to my son eventually, hand-delivered by a young manager who still looked shaken from the mayor's speech. He held it with both hands like it might collapse if gripped too tightly. My son didn't open it right away. He turned it over, studied it, tucked it into his jacket pocket like a wound he wasn't ready to feel yet. He opened it later that night, alone, in his study. The room I had helped design years ago when they first bought the house. The room where I once installed the shelves with him, guiding his hands over the drill, showing him how pressure and patience go hand in hand. The letter inside was handwritten, not typed, not polished, but real. The words didn't sprawl, they stood steady, just like the man they came from. If you're reading this, then I suppose someone finally noticed where I sat. Funny, isn't it? That a chair can mean so much. Thank you for that lesson. It was more valuable than any award or title you could have given me, more revealing than any speech. You taught me something I thought I already knew. That respect cannot be asked for. It cannot be earned by simply surviving or by building or by loving, though we try. It exists, or it doesn't. It reveals itself in silence, in seating arrangements, in forgotten names and glances that pass right through you. And if it only appears when a man in power tells you it should, then you still haven't understood it. True respect is quiet, like the work I did for you, like the pride I held in my chest all these years, watching from the sidelines, and it should never require a microphone to be noticed. I'm not angry. You don't need to apologize. Not to me. Not anymore. I've already left that behind. The hunger for acknowledgement, the need to be seen by those too busy looking ahead. I've fed it long enough, and now I'm full. I didn't stay for dessert, as you noticed. I didn't need sweetness at the end. I had already tasted the bitter truth, and somehow it cleansed me. What I built with love, and I don't regret a single screw turned, a single plan drawn, a single hour spent waiting for the thank you that never came. Because love, when it's real, doesn't demand a return. It just gives and walks on. Take care of what I helped you build, not the buildings, they'll stand, but the name behind them, the memory of who actually held the first beam in place. Because legacy isn't carved into plaques. It lives in whether or not you choose to remember. Dad. They read it aloud days later when the board met again, this time in silence without champagne. My son stood as he read it, voice trembling at first, then steadying like a man finding footing in the very foundation he'd once overlooked. Some cried, not because it was tragic, but because it was true. There was no anger in the letter, no vengeance. Only a reflection held up to them with gentleness, sharper than any blade. And in that room, filled with power and pride, they finally understood the difference between honoring a man because you're told to, and honoring him because you remember who knelt in the dirt so you could rise. They never found me after that. I didn't need to be found. I had left the letter. I had left my truth. And most importantly, I had left on my feet.